In a single afternoon, 10 coffins, 10 children buried under rubble, 7,000 sheep consumed by fire, 3,000 camels stolen, 1,000 oxen slaughtered, 500 donkeys disappeared, servants massacred, wealth evaporated, future carnaled. And Job, the most prosperous man in the East, fell to his knees amid ashes that still smelled of death. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't know while his heart was breaking into pieces, was that his tragedy had begun with a question in heaven. A question that Satan asked God, a wager about whether a human being can love the Creator when he takes everything away except breath. The angels watched in silence because that day the name pronounced before the throne was Job. And when the accuser asked permission to touch him, God said something that shook the entire cosmos. Go ahead. What happened next would rewrite the history of human suffering, because Job was about to demonstrate something that neither heaven nor hell had ever seen. That true faith doesn't die when everything else dies. This is the story of that day. The day when the angels learned that human pain can produce worship more powerful than 1,000 celestial songs. And you, who have lost something you thought irretrievable, are about to discover why your brokenness has invisible witnesses. There was a moment before the catastrophe, a moment when heaven held its breath. Because when Satan speaks in the divine court, someone on earth is about to bleed. Does Job fear God for nothing? Asked the enemy with venom distilled in every syllable. Have you not put a hedge around him, around his household, and everything he has? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But now stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. Job 1, Es 9:11. The silence that followed was heavier than all the stars in the universe. The angels watched, unable to comprehend the magnitude of what was about to happen. Because God didn't reject the proposal. He didn't destroy the accuser with a word. Instead, he allowed something that shook the foundations of the spiritual cosmos. He gave permission. Very well then, everything he has is in your power, but on the man himself do not lay a finger. Job 1:12. And Satan left the presence of God with an apparent victory in his hands. But what the enemy didn't see, what his pride prevented him from perceiving, was the Father's gaze upon Job. A gaze that wasn't of abandonment, but of absolute trust. Because God knew something that Satan could never understand. True faith is not built on blessings, but on the invisible presence of the one who sustains even when everything collapses. The angels descended that night with heavy hearts. They knew what was coming. They knew that Job, that blameless and upright man who feared God and shunned evil, was about to enter a whirlwind that would test whether his faith was refined gold or dry straw. And while the darkness prepared to attack, heaven prepared to witness one of the greatest revelations about the nature of faith ever recorded in Scripture. Because this wasn't just a judgment on one man. It was a revelation about who God is when everything else disappears. It was a question that would pierce through the centuries. Can you love God when he doesn't explain his silence? Can you trust when heaven seems closed and your prayers seem to bounce off a wall of bronze? Job was about to find out. And we centuries later are about to learn with him. Because there's something Satan never understood. When God permits pain, he's not absent. He's preparing a revelation. The sun had barely begun to decline over the land of Oz when the first messenger came running. His clothes torn, his face covered with ash and terror. The angels watched from invisible dimensions, seeing how the enemy's forces moved like a dark tide over Job's life. Satan hadn't wasted time. He had struck with surgical precision, with the calculated cruelty of one who knows exactly where it hurts most. The oxen were plowing, and the donkeys were grazing nearby, and the Sabian attacked and made off with them. They put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. Job 1 is 14 and 15. Job listened, his hands, which moments before had held the bread of peace, now trembled imperceptibly. But before he could process the magnitude of the loss, before he could even form a prayer, a second messenger burst onto the scene, and then a third, and then a fourth. Like waves of perfectly synchronized destruction, the news arrived one after another without respite, without mercy. The fire of God fell from the sky and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. Job chapter 1 verse 16. The angels contemplated with reverent awe. Because this wasn't simply misfortune, it was a coordinated spiritual attack, a demonstration of the destructive power that the enemy can unleash when given permission. Job's riches, those that Satan had mentioned with such contempt before the throne, were being erased from existence in a matter of minutes. 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, and with them, the servants who cared for them. Human lives turned into statistics of a spiritual war they didn't even know was being waged. But the enemy saved his most devastating blow for last. Because Satan didn't just want to destroy Job's wealth. He wanted to destroy his reason for continuing to live. He wanted to tear his heart from his chest and see if even then, in the midst of absolute desolation, the man would continue blessing God's name. The fourth messenger arrived with his face destroyed by weeping, and the words he pronounced were like knives piercing Job's soul. Your sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, when suddenly a mighty wind swept in from the desert and struck the four corners of the house. It collapsed on them and they are dead. And I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. Job 1:18 and 19. Silence. The kind of silence that precedes the collapse of a human soul. The kind of silence in which angels don't dare to breathe. Because at that moment, everything hung by a thread. Job's faith, God's glory, victory or defeat in the heavenly wager. 10 children, 10 lives, an entire family erased in an instant by a wind that wasn't natural but demonic. The angels knew that Satan had used all his cunning to make it seem as if God himself had sent that wind, as if the Heavenly Father had murdered the children of his faithful servant. And in that moment of total darkness, Job did something that shook both heaven and hell. He stood up, he tore his robe, he shaved his head, and then in an act of worship that defies all human logic, he fell to the ground and said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised." Job 1:21. The demons recoiled in shock. Satan clenched his fists with contained fury because the man had not blasphemed. He had not cursed. He had not renounced. Instead, he had done something the enemy could never understand. He had worshipped in the midst of ashes. Scripture records something that many overlook. In all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. Job 1:22. The angels looked at each other in amazement because they had just witnessed something extraordinary. A human being at the lowest point of his existence, choosing to trust a God who had given him no explanations. Job didn't understand why. He didn't know about the conversation in heaven. He didn't know about the wager. He had no idea that his pain was being observed by millions of celestial beings, but even so, he worshipped. And in that act of blind faith, Job demonstrated something that would change the understanding of suffering forever. True faith doesn't need answers. It only needs to know that God remains God, even when the world crumbles. Time on earth is different from time in heaven. For Job, the days dragged like centuries of pain. But in the divine court, what seemed only a blink passed before Satan presented himself again before God's throne. The angels saw him enter, and this time his expression wasn't one of triumphant arrogance, but of barely contained frustration. He had failed. Job had resisted the first onslaught. His faith hadn't broken. The man had lost everything, wealth, livestock, servants, children, and yet he had blessed the Lord's name. The wager seemed lost for the accuser, but those who know the enemy's nature know that he never accepts defeat without attempting a crueler, more personal, more devastating strategy. "Where have you come from?" asked the Lord, and Satan responded with the same words as before, "From roaming throughout the earth, going back and forth on it." Job chapter 2 verse 2. Like a lion seeking whom to devour, like a serpent tracking the scent of fear. But this time the Lord didn't just mention Job, he exalted him. "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. And he still maintains his integrity, though you incited me against him to ruin him without any reason." Job 2:3. Listen carefully to those words, without any reason. God himself acknowledged that Job didn't deserve that suffering. It wasn't punishment. It wasn't correction for hidden sin. It was a test of faith, a revelation of something much deeper than human justice can comprehend. The angels exchanged looks of astonishment because the Father not only defended Job, he declared him victorious, even in the midst of devastation. But Satan wasn't finished. With the bitterness of one who knows he's losing but refuses to withdraw, he launched his second accusation, even darker than the first. Skin for skin. A man will give all he has for his own life. But now stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse you to your face. Job 2:4 and 5. It was a cynical and demonic declaration about human nature. Satan was saying, of course he worshipped when he only lost external things, but if you touch his body, if you give him unbearable physical pain, if you make him suffer in his own flesh day and night without rest, then you'll see who he really is. Then he'll fall. And once again, in a way that shook the entire angelic host, God gave permission. Very well then, he is in your hands, but you must spare his life. Job 2:6. A single restriction. He couldn't kill him, but everything else was permitted. Satan left the Lord's presence with an even more malignant purpose, and what he did next was an attack designed not only to break Job's body, but his identity, his dignity, his value as a human being. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and afflicted Job with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. Job 2:7. The angels watched with reverent horror as Job's body was covered with purulent, painful, repulsive sores. It wasn't just a disease, it was a humiliation designed to destroy all hope. Job, who had been the most prosperous man in the East, now sat in the midst of ashes, scraping his sores with a piece of broken pottery, expelled from his house, separated from society, considered cursed by God. His wife, broken by the pain of losing her 10 children and now seeing her husband turned into a living shadow, said to him the darkest words Job had heard until then. "Are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die." Job 2:9. It was exactly what Satan wanted to hear. The voice closest to Job, the person who shared his most intimate pain, was saying, "Give up, let it go, curse and end this." The demons celebrated. Satan smiled because it seemed that finally Job was about to break. But then from the ashes, from the purulent sore, from the destroyed body and bleeding heart, Job spoke, and his words were like a sword of light piercing through the darkness. "You are talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" Job 2:10. And Scripture records something that made heaven burst into silent praise. In all this, Job did not sin in what he said. Job 2:10. Second round, second victory. And Satan once again had been defeated by the unbreakable faith of a man who chose to trust even when he didn't understand. There was a moment in Job's hell of suffering that the angels considered perhaps the most painful of all. It wasn't when he lost his riches. It wasn't when his children died. not even when his body was covered with sores. It was when his friends arrived. 3 men, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. Men of position, of religious knowledge, of years of experience in God's ways. When they learned of the calamity that had befallen Job, they agreed to come together to console and comfort him. A noble intention, a beautiful gesture, or so it seemed. When they saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. Job 2:12. Think about that phrase for a moment. Job was so disfigured, so transformed by suffering that his own friends didn't recognize him. Pain had rewritten his face. Disease had erased his visible identity. And when they finally realized who that human specter sitting in the ashes was, they did something profoundly human. They began to weep aloud, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. Then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him, because they saw how great his suffering was. Job 2:12 and 13. 7 days, 7 nights in absolute silence. The angels watched that circle of shared pain with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Because the silence of those first 7 days was paradoxically the greatest comfort Job received from his friends. They didn't try to explain. They didn't preach. They didn't theologize. They were simply present. And there are moments when silent presence is the only language that pain can understand. But then the silence was broken, and with it, any hope of true comfort was also broken. Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. He didn't curse God as Satan had predicted, but he cursed his own existence, wishing he had never been born, longing for death as a refuge from the unbearable torment his life had become. May the day of my birth perish, and the night that said a boy is conceived. Job 3 verse 3. It was the cry of a shattered soul, the lament of someone who had reached the limit of what a human spirit can endure. And in that moment of total vulnerability, his friends did something that turned them, not into comforters but into accusers. They began to judge him. Eliphaz was the first to speak, and his words, though wrapped in religious diplomacy, were like salt in Job's wounds. Consider now who, being innocent, has ever perished. Where were the upright ever destroyed? Job 4.7. The implication was as clear as water. Job, if you're suffering like this, it's because you've sinned. God is just. Therefore, this pain must be punishment. The equation was simple, logical, theologically coherent, and completely wrong. The angels watched with sadness as Job's friends, one after another, built elaborate theological arguments to defend God from an accusation no one was making. They defended divine justice by attacking Job's integrity. They explained the mystery of suffering by reducing Job to a secret sinner who was finally getting what he deserved. Bildad was more direct. When your children sinned against him, he gave them over to the penalty of their sin. Job 8:4, insinuating that Job's 10 children had died because they were wicked, that their death was justice, not tragedy. And Zophar closed the circle with brutal arrogance. Know this, God has even forgotten some of your sin. Job 11:6, telling a man who had lost everything, who was covered with sores, whose children were dead, that he was actually getting off easy. This was Job's new test, and perhaps the most difficult of all, because it's one thing to suffer loss. It's another thing to suffer physical pain, but to suffer the misunderstanding, judgment, and condemnation of those who should be by your side. That's a kind of loneliness that cuts deeper than any sword. Job responded with passion, with pain, with a brutal honesty that made his accusers uncomfortable. Miserable comforters are you all. Job 16:2. And in the midst of his defense, Job said something that the angels engraved in their hearts as one of the most powerful declarations of faith ever spoken by human lips. I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand on the earth, and after my skin has been destroyed, Yet in my flesh I will see God. Job 19:25 and 26. In the midst of accusation, in the midst of pain, in the midst of total misunderstanding, Job kept believing. He didn't understand, but he believed. And that faith in the midst of chaos was exactly what God had seen in him from the beginning. The chapters multiplied. The arguments became more aggressive. Job's friends, convinced of their own theological righteousness, intensified their accusations. And Job, exhausted but not defeated, continued defending his integrity. Not because he was perfect, he himself acknowledged being human and fallible, but because he knew deep in his being that this suffering was not the consequence of some hidden sin. The angels watched the development of this theological debate with a mixture of fascination and sadness, because everyone in heaven knew the truth. Job was suffering not for his wickedness, but for his goodness. Not because God was punishing him, but because God trusted him enough to allow him to be tested. But Job didn't know that. And in his ignorance of the heavenly context, he began to do something dangerous and beautiful at the same time. He began to demand an audience with God. He wanted answers. He wanted to confront the Almighty face to face and ask him directly why. If only I knew where to find him. If only I could go to his dwelling. Job 23:3. It was a cry of desperation, yes, but it was also an act of extraordinary faith, because Job wasn't running from God. He was running toward him, not to curse him, as Satan had predicted, but to understand him, to find meaning in the midst of chaos. His friends were scandalized. Eliphaz accused him of multiplying words without knowledge. Bildad labeled him impious for daring to question divine ways. Zophar suggested Job was delirious, that his pain had driven him mad. But then a fourth character appeared on the scene, a young man named Elihu, who had been listening to the entire debate in silence. And when he finally spoke, he did so with a righteous indignation that surprised both Job and his three friends. But he was also angry with Job for justifying himself rather than God. He was also angry with the three friends because they had found no way to refute Job and yet had condemned him. Job 32, E's 2 and 3. Elihu saw something the others had overlooked. Both sides were wrong. Job was so focused on defending his own righteousness that he had begun to question God's righteousness. And the three friends were so obsessed with defending God's righteousness that they had destroyed Job's dignity. Elihu's words were like a bridge between human pain and divine sovereignty. He acknowledged Job's suffering as real and valid, but also pointed out that God doesn't owe man explanations, that the Creator of the universe has purposes that transcend our limited understanding. But I tell you, in this you are not right, for God is greater than any mortal. Why do you complain to him that he responds to no one's words? Job 33:12 and 13. The angels leaned forward with renewed attention, because Elihu, though young and impetuous, was setting the stage for something everyone in heaven knew was about to happen. Something that would change not only Job's perspective, but humanity's understanding of the mystery of suffering. God himself was about to speak, and when the Almighty breaks his silence, when the Creator decides to respond to his creature's cry, he never does it the way we expect. He doesn't come with detailed explanations. He doesn't present a celestial PowerPoint justifying each decision. He doesn't offer apologies or compensations. He comes with questions, and his questions are more powerful than 1,000 human answers. Then, after chapters of human arguments, after accusations and defenses, after theology and counter-theology, after the longest and heaviest silence Job had ever experienced, heaven opened, not with soft light, not with angelic music, not with words of sweet comfort and understanding explanations. Then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. Job 38:1. A storm, a whirlwind of wind and power that shook the earth where Job sat. The angels prostrated themselves in worship. Because when God speaks from the whirlwind, he doesn't come as a patient teacher, but as the sovereign king, reminding his creation who is really in charge. And the first words that came from the Almighty's mouth were not of explanation, but of loving confrontation. Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. I will question you and you shall answer me. Job 38 as 2 and 3. Job had asked for an audience. He had demanded answers. He had wanted to take his case to the divine tribunal, and God granted him that audience. But not in the way Job had imagined. Instead of answering Job's questions, God asked him questions. And each question was like a blow of loving humility, reminding the wounded and confused human how small his perspective was compared to the immensity of divine design. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set? Or who laid its cornerstone while the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy? Job 38 Es 4-7. The angels remembered that day, the day of creation, when the stars sang together and all celestial beings shouted for joy, seeing the earth, sky, oceans, mountains emerge from nothing. Job wasn't there. No human being was there. And yet now Job was questioning the wisdom of the one who had orchestrated all of that. The questions continued one after another, relentless, beautiful, devastating in their simplicity. Have you ever given orders to the morning or shown the dawn its place? Job 38:12. Have you journeyed to the springs of the sea or walked in the recesses of the depths? Job 38:16. Have the gates of death been shown to you? Have you seen the gates of the deepest darkness? Job 38:17. Each question was a reminder. Each interrogation was a revelation. God wasn't being cruel. He was being real. He was showing Job that the universe is infinitely more complex, more mysterious, more wonderfully intricate than any human mind can comprehend. If Job couldn't understand how a storm works, how did he presume to understand God's eternal purposes? If Job didn't know where snow is stored or how dew is born, how could he judge the wisdom behind his own suffering? Then God took the questions to another level. He began to speak of the creatures he had created: the lion, the raven, the mountain goat, the wild donkey, the ostrich, the horse, the hawk, the eagle. Each animal was a testimony to the Creator's meticulous care and intentional design. Who provides food for the raven when its young cry out to God and wander about for lack of food? Job 38:41. If God cares for the raven's young, had he forgotten Job? And then, as the culmination of this divine lecture on sovereignty and care, God presented two creatures that left Job speechless: Behemoth and Leviathan, beasts of incomprehensible power, creatures that only God can control, symbols of chaos and brute force that exist in the universe and that only the Almighty can tame. Look at Behemoth, which I made along with you and which feeds on grass like an ox. What strength it has in its loins, what power in the muscles of its belly. Job 40:15 and 16. The message was clear. If God created and controls these uncontainable forces, couldn't he handle Job's situation? Didn't he have the power and wisdom to direct even suffering toward a purpose Job couldn't see yet? And then, in the midst of this tsunami of divine questions, Job did something extraordinary, something all the angels had been waiting to see. He surrendered, not in defeat, but in worship. There was a moment of silence after the whirlwind, a different silence from the one that had preceded God's voice. This silence wasn't empty. It was full of the overwhelming presence of the Almighty, full of the revelation Job had just received, and full of something that would change his life forever. Perspective. Job had demanded answers. He had wanted to know why. He had asked for a detailed explanation of each element of his suffering. And God, in his infinite wisdom, didn't give him any of those things. Instead, he gave him something much better. He gave him himself. Job responded to the Lord with words that the angels memorized as one of the deepest confessions of faith ever spoken. Job replied to the Lord, "I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted." You asked, "Who is this that obscures my plans without knowledge?" Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. Job 42:1 1-3. Listen to the change in his voice. There's no more accusation, no more demand for justification. Job finally understood something that would transform his pain. He didn't need to understand God's purposes to trust him. He didn't need to see the complete picture to know the painter knew what he was doing. And then Job said something that resonates through the centuries, like the echo of every soul that has walked through the valley of the shadow of death and emerged transformed on the other side. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. Job 42:5-6. My ears had heard of you. Before suffering, Job knew God by reputation. He knew the stories, he knew the theology, he knew the traditions and teachings. He was a godly man, yes, but his knowledge of God was second-hand. It was information, not revelation. But now my eyes have seen you. Suffering had done something prosperity could never do. It had led him to a personal and intimate encounter with the living God. Not through explanations, but through presence, not through answers, but through revelation. Job didn't get the explanation he was asking for. He never knew about the conversation in heaven. He never found out that Satan had bet against him. He never fully understood why he had lost everything. And yet he emerged from that experience, not embittered, but transformed, because he had learned the most important lesson any human being can learn. God himself is enough. His presence is more valuable than any explanation. His company is more comforting than any answer. The angels watched with reverence as something extraordinary began to happen. Because when Job repented, not of specific sins he had committed, but of his attitude of demanding total understanding of divine mysteries, God activated restoration. First, he dealt with Job's 3 friends, and his words toward them were harsh and direct. "I am angry with you and your 2 friends because you have not spoken the truth about me as my servant Job has." Job 42:7. Ironically, those who had spent chapters defending God were rebuked by him, while Job, who had questioned and struggled and cried out in the midst of his pain, was vindicated. Because God prefers the brutal honesty of a wounded heart to the superficial piety of compassionless theology. And then God asked Job to do something extraordinary. Pray for his friends, the same ones who had accused him, the same ones who had added pain to pain, the same ones who had judged him without mercy. So now take 7 bulls and 7 rams, and go to my servant Job, and sacrifice a burnt offering for yourselves. My servant Job will pray for you, and I will accept his prayer and not deal with you according to your folly. You have not spoken the truth about me as my servant Job has. Job 42:8, and Job prayed, despite everything, despite the pain they had caused him, despite the unjust accusations, he prayed. And in that act of forgiveness and intercession, something broke in the spiritual realm. After Job had prayed for his friends, the Lord restored his fortunes and gave him twice as much as he had before. Job chapter 42, verse 10. Restoration began not when Job demanded justice for himself, but when he interceded for those who had hurt him. The angels who had observed every moment of Job's suffering now contemplated with indescribable joy the restoration. Because God didn't just heal Job, he blessed him in ways that surpassed everything he had lost. The Lord blessed the latter part of Job's life more than the former part. He had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxmen, and 1,000 donkeys. Job 42. Double what he had before. Not as mechanical reward, but as testimony that God never abandons those who trust him, even when they don't understand his ways. But the most moving restoration wasn't material. It was relational. And he also had 7 sons and 3 daughters. Job 42 and 13. 10 children, the same number he had lost. And although these new children could never replace those who died, they were a testimony that God gives new life even after the most devastating death. Scripture records something beautiful about Job's daughters. Nowhere in all the land were there found women as beautiful as Job's daughters, and their father granted them an inheritance along with their brothers. Job 42, 1-15. In a culture where daughters rarely received inheritance, Job honored them equally. Suffering had taught him to value differently, to love more deeply, to see with renewed eyes what really matters. After this, Job lived 140 years. He saw his children and their children to the 4th generation. And so, Job died, an old man and full of years. Job 42, 16 and 17, full of years. He didn't just live a long time, he lived fully. Each day was a gift he appreciated with the perspective of someone who had been at the bottom of the pit and been lifted by divine hands. The angels reflected on everything they had witnessed, and they began to understand something that even they, in their heavenly wisdom, hadn't fully understood at the beginning. This wasn't simply the account of a man who suffered and was restored. It was a revelation about the very nature of faith, suffering, and divine purpose. Job never knew why he suffered. And that's precisely the lesson, because true faith is not built on answers, but on relationship. It's not founded on understanding, but on trust. It doesn't require seeing the complete plan, only knowing the planner. Satan had bet that Job served God only for the benefits, that his faith was transactional, that by removing the blessings he would remove the worship. And he was completely devastatingly defeated because Job demonstrated that it's possible to love God even when God doesn't make sense. It's possible to trust even when heaven seems closed. It's possible to worship even when everything has been lost. And in that demonstration, Job didn't just defeat Satan. He revealed something about the human heart that glorifies God more than 1,000 praises in times of prosperity, the capacity to choose faith in the midst of darkness. The angels then understood why God had permitted all of that. Not because Job needed to be punished or corrected, but because the entire universe, visible and invisible, earthly and celestial, needed to see that genuine faith can survive the worst of earthly hells. And when that faith survives, when that fragile and broken human being chooses to bless instead of curse, chooses to trust instead of give up, chooses to worship instead of abandon, then something sacred happens. Heaven bows in worship, demons flee in defeat, and God himself smiles with the pride of a father who always knew his son would endure. After everything ended, after Job was restored and lived his additional 140 years, after he saw his great-grandchildren and died full of days and peace, the angels gathered in silence to reflect on what they had witnessed, because they, in their celestial perfection, had learned something about human beings that they had never fully understood before. Something about faith under fire. Something about the beauty of trust when all logical reasoning says you should give up. The angels had never experienced suffering. They had never lost anything. They had never known physical pain, devastating loss, the agony of burying a child. They didn't have bodies that could get sick. They didn't have possessions that could be destroyed. They didn't have the limitation of not being able to see beyond the veil between the natural and supernatural. Therefore, their worship, though pure and constant, was in a certain way untainted by darkness, clean, but also in a certain sense untested. Job taught them something different. He showed them that there's a type of worship that can only arise from suffering, a type of faith that can only be forged in the fire of the most extreme test, a type of trust that only has value when there are all the logical reasons to distrust. They learned that when a human being limited by time and space, blinded by ignorance of God's complete plan, overwhelmed by inexplicable loss, still chooses to say, "Blessed be the name of the Lord." That act of will glorifies God in a way that transcends all angelic worship. Because angels worship God while constantly seeing His glory, Job worshipped God without seeing anything except darkness. And that worship in darkness is more precious in the Father's eyes than 1,000 songs in the light. The angels also learned something about Satan. They saw firsthand his nature as accuser, his cynicism, his inability to comprehend selfless love, his conviction that every human being is fundamentally selfish, moved only by personal benefit. And they saw how he was completely refuted by a man covered with sores sitting in ashes. Satan lost more than a wager that day. He lost any credibility he might have had in his accusations against humanity. Because if Job, with all the reasons in the world to give up, chose to remain faithful, then Satan's argument that human faith is only mercenary was destroyed forever. The angels also contemplated God's wisdom in not giving explanations. Because if Job had known about the heavenly conversation, if he had understood that everything was a test, would his faith have been genuine? Or would he simply have been playing a role knowing there was an audience watching? The beauty of Job's faith lay precisely in his ignorance. He didn't know the angels were watching him. He didn't know Satan had bet against him. He didn't know his resistance was rewriting the narrative about what it means to trust God. He simply trusted in absolute darkness without apparent reason, without visible reward, without audible explanation. And that blind trust became the brightest light the spiritual universe had ever seen. The angels realized that every human being who suffers has an invisible audience. Every person who walks through the valley of the shadow of death is being watched not only by God, but by countless spiritual beings who long to see if human faith is real or fake. Every time someone chooses to trust instead of renounce, every time someone blesses instead of curses, every time someone worships in the ashes instead of abandoning in bitterness, the angels are amazed again because they're seeing something they themselves cannot produce. Faith forged in fire. And they understood why God values humanity so much. Not because they're perfect. Clearly they're not. Not because they're powerful. They're fragile as clay. Not because they're wise. Their understanding is infinite, decimally small compared to eternity. God values humanity because in their weakness, they can choose the strength of faith. In their ignorance, they can choose trust. In their pain, they can choose worship. And those choices made in genuine freedom and in the midst of crushing circumstances are more precious in God's eyes than all the automatic worship of beings who have never been tested. Now, after traveling through this ancient account, after observing through the angel's eyes the most severe test a righteous human being ever faced, we come to the most important moment. What does this mean for you? Because this is not just a story about a man named Job who lived thousands of years ago in the land of Oz. It's your story. It's the story of every person who has looked at heaven in the midst of darkness and asked why. Maybe you're sitting in your own ashes right now. Maybe you've lost something you thought you could never lose. Maybe your body is sick. Your heart is broken. Your future seems cannelled. Maybe the voices that should console you are accusing you. Maybe God's silence is so deafening it hurts more than the sores on your skin. And maybe, like Job, you're tempted to think God has abandoned you, that you've done something terrible to deserve this, that your faith isn't enough, that you should just give up. But let me tell you what the angels saw in Job and what God sees in you right now. They see faith even when you only see doubt. They see endurance even when you only feel weakness. They see worship even when you only hear your own groans. Because faith is not the absence of pain. It's the choice to trust in the midst of it. Faith is not having all the answers. It's knowing the one who has them even when he doesn't share them. Faith is not feeling close to God. It's clinging to him even when he seems 1,000,000 miles away. Job never understood why he had to suffer. And it's very likely you won't fully understand the purpose of your pain right now either. And that's okay, because God isn't asking you to understand. He's asking you to trust. Trust that he sees what you don't see. Trust that he knows what you don't know. Trust that he's working even when everything seems to be falling apart. The angels learned that inexplicable suffering is not evidence of divine abandonment. It's evidence of divine trust. God allows you to be tested not because he doubts you, but because he knows what's inside you. He knows your faith can withstand whatever hell itself throws against it. And when you come out on the other side, because you will, you'll be like Job. Not perfect, but transformed with a deeper understanding of who God is. With a richer appreciation of what really matters, with a faith that has been tested and has endured. Satan is still betting against you. He still believes that if it gets hard enough, painful enough, confusing enough, you'll give up, you'll curse, you'll abandon. But God believes something different. He believes you're capable of a faith that transcends circumstances, of a worship that doesn't depend on explanations, of a trust that doesn't require seeing the end before taking the next step. And the angels are watching. Watching to see if your generation will demonstrate the same thing Job demonstrated. That love for God is not transactional. That faith is not a benefits contract. That worship can arise from dust and ashes as much as from palaces and prosperity. So what will you choose today when pain tightens? When answers don't come? When heaven seems closed and your friends judge you and your body rebels and your heart breaks, will you choose bitterness or blessing? Will you choose doubt or trust? Will you choose to curse or to worship? Because that choice made in your darkest moment is what will define not only your destiny, but your eternal character. It's what will determine whether you're like gold that emerges purified from fire or like chaff that's consumed in it. Job chose, and his choice resonated through the centuries as an eternal testimony that genuine faith can survive hell itself. Now it's your turn to choose. And when you do, when you choose to trust though you don't understand, when you choose to worship though you don't feel, when you choose to bless though everything hurts, the angels will bow in renewed worship. Satan will flee defeated. And God will smile with the pride of a father who always knew his child would endure. Because in the end, Job learned what we all must learn. God doesn't always calm the storm. Sometimes he calms his child in the midst of it. And that peace that surpasses all understanding, that ability to be calm while the whirlwind rages around, is the most powerful testimony that God is present even when he seems absent. May your pain become purpose. May your brokenness become beauty. May your dark night become a glorious dawn. And when you finally see God face to face, when all questions are answered and all mysteries revealed, you'll discover what Job discovered, that he himself is the answer you were always seeking. He didn't explain the suffering. He revealed himself in the midst of it, and that is enough. Final reflection. Leave in the comments one word that represents your faith today. I will endure. I will trust. I will worship. I will hope. The angels are watching.